Picture this. It's April 1976. A 21-year-old college dropout stands in his parents' garage in Los Altos, California. His hair's a mess. He hasn't showered in days. And he's about to change the world. His name? Steve Jobs. Today, that company he started in that garage is worth over $3 trillion. That's trillion, with a T dot. But here's what makes Steve's story different from every other tech billionaire you've heard about. He didn't just build a company. He didn't just make money. He fundamentally changed how humans interact with technology 5 different times. This is the story of how an adopted kid who dropped out of college became one of the most influential entrepreneurs in history. And trust me, the path he took was anything but conventional. Let's start at the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning. February 24, 1955, San Francisco. A young woman named Joanne Schiebel gives birth to a baby boy. But there's a problem. Joanne's not married. Her father, a strict German immigrant from Wisconsin, has threatened to disown her if she marries the baby's father, a Muslim teaching assistant from Syria named Abdul Fattah Jandali. So Joanne makes an impossible decision. She gives up her baby for adoption. But here's where it gets interesting. Joanne had one non-negotiable requirement. Her son had to be adopted by college graduates. She wanted to make sure he'd have the education and opportunities she couldn't provide as an unwed mother in 1950s America. The adoption agency found the perfect couple, a lawyer and his wife, college educated, financially stable. Everything looked perfect until the baby was born. When the lawyer and his wife learned the baby was a boy, they backed out. They wanted a girl. So who ended up adopting this baby who would become Steve Jobs? A high school dropout named Paul Jobs and his wife Clara, a woman who'd never graduated from college either. When Joanne found out her baby was being placed with a couple who hadn't even finished high school, she refused to sign the adoption papers. For weeks, she held out. The baby was already living with Paul and Clara, but legally, he wasn't theirs. Finally, Joanne agreed, but only on one condition. Paul and Clara had to sign a pledge, a literal written promise that they would save money and send this boy to college. They signed it. And on that day, Steve and Paul Jobs officially became their son. Now, Paul Jobs wasn't some deadbeat high school dropout. This guy was tough. He'd been a Coast Guard machinist during World War II. He'd ferried troops to Italy for General Patton. And after the war, he made a bet with his crewmates in San Francisco that he could find a wife in 2 weeks. He won that bet when he met Clara Hagopian, a sweet-humored daughter of Armenian immigrants who'd fled the Turkish genocide. Their marriage would last over 40 years. Paul was a mechanic, not just any mechanic, a craftsman. He could take apart a car engine, rebuild it, and make it purr like new. After the war, he worked as a repo man for a finance company. That means he'd pick the locks of cars whose owners couldn't make their payments and repossess them. Then he'd fix them up and sell them. The family lived in the Sunset District of San Francisco at first, but by 1960, when Steve was 5 years old, they moved south to Mountain View, right in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley. Though back then it was all apricot orchards and aerospace contractors, not tech startups. Paul Jobs set up a workbench in his garage, and this is where something crucial happened in Steve's development. Paul would work on cars, and he'd let young Steve help. He taught Steve about craftsmanship, about the importance of details. about how the back of a cabinet should be finished just as beautifully as the front, even though nobody would ever see it. When you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, Paul told his son, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back, even though it faces the wall and nobody will ever see it. You know it's there, so you're going to use a beautiful piece of wood on the back. For you to sleep well at night, the aesthetic, the quality, has to be carried all the way through. Steve Jobs never forgot that lesson. Decades later, when he was designing the Mac and iPhone, he'd insist that even the parts you couldn't see had to be beautiful. Engineers thought he was crazy, but Steve knew the back of the cabinet mattered. Steve wasn't an easy kid to raise. He was smart, scary smart, but he was also stubborn, demanding, and difficult. By the time he reached 4th grade, his teachers didn't know what to do with him. He was bored. He acted out. He got in trouble. Then he met Imogene Hill. She was his 4th grade teacher, and she saw something in Steve that others had missed. She didn't try to control him. Instead, she bribed him. She'd give him lollipops and $5 bills if he'd finish his math workbooks. It worked. Years later, Jobs would say, I learned more from her than any other teacher, and if it hadn't been for her, I'm sure I would have gone to jail. That's not an exaggeration. Steve was headed down a bad path, and Imogene Hill turned him around. She did something else, too. She got Steve to skip 5th grade. When he entered middle school, he was a year younger than his classmates and light years ahead academically. But here's the thing about being smart and difficult. It doesn't always make you popular. Middle school was rough for Steve. The school was rough, period. Kids brought knives. There were gangs. This sensitive, weird kid who'd rather talk about electronics than sports didn't fit in. After 7th grade, Steve gave his parents an ultimatum. Either they moved to a better school district or he was dropping out. Remember, this kid was 12 years old. Most 12-year-olds don't issue ultimatums to their parents. But Paul and Clara Jobs had made a promise. They'd pledged to make sure Steve got an education. So they did something that was financially painful for them. They scraped together money and moved to Los Altos, a nicer suburb with better schools. It nearly broke them financially, but they kept their promise. And that move changed everything. In Los Altos, Steve Jobs entered Homestead High School, and suddenly he was in a different world. This was the early 1970s in Silicon Valley. The defense industry was booming, tech companies were sprouting up, and smart, nerdy kids who were into electronics. They were everywhere. Steve met a kid named Bill Fernandez, who introduced him to someone who would change his life. A guy named Steve Wozniak. Woz, as everyone called him, was 5 years older than Jobs. But they clicked instantly. Woz was an electronics genius. He could design circuits in his head. He lived and breathed technology. And he had the same mischievous sense of humor as Jobs. Their first collaboration? A device called the Blue Box. Here's what you need to understand about the 1970s phone system. It was all analog, and if you could generate certain tones at certain frequencies, you could trick the phone system into giving you free long-distance calls. This was completely illegal, by the way. But to Woz and Steve, it was irresistible. Woz read an article in Esquire magazine about phone freaks, hackers who'd figured out how to beat the phone system. He designed a digital blue box that could generate the tones. Steve immediately saw the business opportunity. They started making blue boxes and selling them to students at Berkeley for $150 apiece. They probably sold 100 or so before they got scared they'd get caught and stopped. But here's what matters. This was the moment Steve Jobs learned a crucial lesson. Woz could invent amazing technology, but Steve could figure out how to turn that technology into a product people would pay for. Woz later said, "It gave us a taste of what we could do with my engineering skills and his vision. The Blue Box adventure established a template for our partnership. That template would be worth billions." In 1972, Steve Jobs graduated from high school and enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Reed was expensive, really expensive, and remember, Paul and Clara Jobs weren't wealthy. They were working-class people who'd saved every penny to keep their promise about college. Steve lasted one semester. Here's how he explained it years later. "After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay." Most 19-year-olds who drop out of college go home. Not Steve. He hung around Reed for another 18 months, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposit to buy food, and walking 7 miles every Sunday to get a free meal at the Hare Krishna temple. But he also did something brilliant. He dropped in on whatever classes interested him. No pressure, no grades, just pure learning for its own sake. One of those classes was calligraphy. Reed had perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Steve learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. "None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life," Jobs said. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me, and we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If he'd never dropped in on that calligraphy class, personal computers might have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. After his Reed College days, Steve came back to California. It was 1974. He was 19 years old, no degree, no clear direction, but he needed money. He applied for a job at Atari, the video game company that had just launched Pong. When he showed up for his interview, he told the personnel director, "I'm not leaving until you hire me." The director called over the chief engineer, Al Alcorn, and said, "We've got a hippie kid in the lobby. He says he won't leave until we hire him. Should we call the cops or hire him?" Alcorn took one look at Steve and hired him, partly because Atari's motto was, "Don't do it if it's not fun," and Steve seemed interesting, partly because Steve clearly understood video games. But Steve wasn't easy to work with. He had what you might call personal hygiene issues. He'd adopted a fruitarian diet and believed that eating only fruits meant he didn't need to shower. His coworkers disagreed, violently. So Atari put Steve on the night shift. He'd come in after everyone else left and work alone. Problem solved. While working at Atari, Steve saved up money for something he'd been planning, a trip to India. He wanted to find spiritual enlightenment. This was the mid-70s. Lots of young people were going to India searching for meaning. But Steve took it to another level. He spent 7 months in India. He shaved his head. He wore traditional Indian clothing. He experimented with psychedelic drugs. He studied Buddhism and meditation. He came back transformed, but also disillusioned. "We weren't going to find a place where we could go for a month to be enlightened," he later said. "It was one of the first times that I started to realize that maybe Thomas Edison did a lot more to improve the world than Karl Marx and Neem Karoli Baba put together." That realization would shape everything that followed. Steve Jobs decided that changing the world through technology was his path to enlightenment. By 1975, Steve was back at Atari and reconnecting with Woz. And Woz was up to something interesting. He'd been going to meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club, a group of hobbyists and hackers who were passionate about building personal computers. Now understand. In 1975, there was no such thing as a personal computer as we know it today. Computers were massive machines that filled entire rooms and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were for corporations and universities, not regular people. But the homebrew crowd believed that was about to change. The Altair 8800 had just been released, a kit computer that hobbyists could build themselves. It was primitive. It had no keyboard, no screen, just switches and lights. But it proved something could be done. Woz looked at the Altair and thought, "I can do better than that." And he did. He designed a computer that used a TV as a screen and a keyboard for input. Revolutionary concepts at the time. He'd bring his computer to homebrew meetings and show it off. He wasn't trying to make money from it. The homebrew ethos was all about sharing and collaboration. Woz just wanted to impress his friends. But Steve Jobs saw something different. He saw a product, a business, an opportunity. "We should start a company," Steve told Woz. At first, Woz wasn't interested. He was happy at his job at Hewlett-Packard. He was happy sharing his designs for free. Why complicate things with commerce? But Steve kept pushing. He made an argument that Woz found irresistible. "Even if we lose money, we'll have a company. For once in our lives, we'll have our own company." That did it, not the prospect of getting rich, just the adventure of starting something together. Two friends, a crazy dream. What could be better? To raise money for their new venture, Woz sold his HP 65 calculator for $500. Steve sold his Volkswagen bus for $1,500. With about $1,300 in working capital, they were ready to start a business. But they needed a name. Steve had just come back from a visit to an apple orchard in Oregon. The place was called the All-One Farm, a commune where he'd been pruning Gravenstein apple trees. On the drive back to Los Altos, Steve and Woz threw around ideas. They considered technical-sounding names like Matrix and Executech. Nothing felt right. Finally, Steve proposed Apple Computer. "I was on one of my fruitarian diets," he later explained. "I had just come back from the apple farm. It sounded fun, spirited, and not intimidating. Apple took the edge off the word computer. Plus, it would get us ahead of Atari in the phone book." They gave themselves until the next afternoon to think of something better. Nothing came to them. So Apple Computer it was. Think about that name for a second. Apple Computer. It doesn't make sense, right? Apples and computers have nothing to do with each other. But that's exactly why it worked. It forced your brain to pause, to dwell on it, to remember it. Mike Markkula, who would soon become Apple's first chairman, put it perfectly. So it forces your brain to dwell on it. Apple and computers, that doesn't go together. So it helped us grow brand awareness. Sometimes the best business decisions seem crazy at the time. Now they had a company name, but there was a problem. Woz was still working at HP, and he felt loyal to them. In his mind, anything he designed while working at HP belonged to HP. It was the right thing to do, the ethical thing. Steve Jobs recruited Ron Wayne, a middle-aged engineer at Atari, to help convince Woz to fully commit to Apple. Together, they spent 2 hours in a round-table discussion at Wayne's apartment. Wayne made a compelling argument. A great engineer would only be remembered if he teamed with a great marketer, and that required Woz to commit his designs to their partnership. Woz finally agreed, and Wayne got a 10% stake in Apple for his trouble. But here's something fascinating about Woz and Steve's partnership. They were complete opposites. Jobs could be charismatic, even mesmerizing, but also cold and brutal. He'd manipulate people to get things done. Wozniak was shy and socially awkward, which made him seem childishly sweet. Woz is very bright in some areas, Jobs later said, but he's almost like a savant, since he was so stunted when it came to dealing with people he didn't know. But that's exactly why they worked. Jobs was awed by Wozniak's engineering genius. Wozniak was awed by Jobs's business drive. "I never wanted to deal with people and step on toes," Woz recalled, but Steve could call up people he didn't know and make them do things. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, neither would have achieved what they did. Their first product was the Apple I. It wasn't really a computer in the modern sense. It was a circuit board. You had to provide your own case, power supply, keyboard, and monitor. But for hobbyists in 1976, it was perfect. Steve Jobs convinced Paul Terrell, the owner of the Byte Shop computer store, to buy 50 Apple I boards for $500 each. That's $25,000, more money than Steve had ever seen in his life. There was just one problem. They had to build them fast. Steve's parents' garage became the factory. His bedroom became inventory storage. His sister's bedroom became the shipping department. The entire Jobs household was mobilized. They worked around the clock. Woz would come over after his day job at HP. Steve would test the boards. Clara Jobs would handle the accounting. Paul Jobs would drive to pick up parts. They delivered all 50 boards to the Byte Shop on time. And just like that, Apple Computer was a real business with real revenue. But Steve Jobs was already thinking bigger, way bigger. The Apple I was for hobbyists, people who understood electronics, people who were willing to spend hours assembling and configuring their computer. But Steve saw a different market, regular people, people who didn't know anything about electronics but wanted the power of computing. He pushed Woz to design something new, a complete computer. Just plug it in and it works. No assembly required. Woz was skeptical. Why would anyone need a computer at home, he asked. Remember, this was 1976. The internet didn't exist. Email didn't exist. There was no obvious reason for regular people to own computers. But Steve had a vision, and he was convincing. Woz started designing what would become the Apple II. The Apple II wasn't just an incremental improvement over the Apple I. It was a quantum leap. Woz designed it to display color graphics. Revolutionary. It could connect to a TV. It came in a sleek plastic case that looked like it belonged in someone's home, not a lab. And it was expandable, with slots for adding new capabilities. But creating the Apple II required more money than they had. A lot more money. They needed professional investors. Enter Mike Markkula. Markkula was a 33-year-old engineer who'd retired early after making millions from stock options at Intel. He was intrigued by what Jobs and Wozniak were building. He met with them, saw the Apple II prototype, and made a decision that would change history. He invested $250,000 of his own money. More importantly, he taught Steve Jobs how to think like a businessman, how to write a business plan, how to value a company, how to approach venture capitalists. Markkula created Apple's first business plan. It had one memorable phrase: "We are gambling on our vision, and we would rather do that than make Me Too products." That philosophy would define Apple for the next 40 years. With Markkula's investment and guidance, Apple Computer Incorporated on January 3, 1977. Markkula got 30%, Jobs got 30%, Wozniak got 30%, and Ron Wayne, well, Wayne had already sold his 10% stake for $800 because he was worried about the company's debts. That 10% would eventually be worth billions. Sometimes caution is the most expensive decision you can make. The Apple II launched in April 1977, and it was a hit. Not an instant smash hit, but a steady, growing success. By the end of 1978, Apple had sold thousands of units and was generating millions in revenue. What made the Apple II special wasn't just the hardware, it was the software, and specifically a program called VisiCalc. VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet program. Before VisiCalc, businesses did their calculations by hand or with calculators. It took hours. VisiCalc could do the same calculations instantly, change one number, and all the related calculations updated automatically. Business people went crazy for it, and VisiCalc only ran on the Apple II. Companies started buying Apple IIs just to run VisiCalc. Steve Jobs didn't create VisiCalc, but he created the platform that made VisiCalc possible. That's a crucial distinction. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can build is the platform that enables others to innovate. By 1980, Apple was the fastest-growing company in American business history. They went public on December 12, 1980. The stock offering valued the company at $1.79 billion. Steve Jobs, at 25 years old, was suddenly worth $256 million. He was the youngest person on the Forbes 400 list of wealthiest Americans. But here's the thing, Steve Jobs wasn't satisfied because he knew something others didn't. The Apple II wasn't the future. It was just a stepping stone. In December 1979, Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC. That's the Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox's legendary R&D facility. Xerox had developed incredible technology: the graphical user interface, the mouse, bitmap displays, object-oriented programming. When Jobs saw what Xerox had created, he couldn't believe it. "Why aren't you doing anything with this?" he asked. "This is incredible." Xerox didn't see the commercial potential. To them, computers were for scientists and businesses. This graphical stuff was just research. But Steve Jobs saw the future. He immediately understood that this was how everyone would use computers in 10 years. Not typing commands, not dealing with code, just pointing and clicking with a mouse. He rushed back to Apple and told his team, "We need to do this, and we need to do it better than Xerox." The result was 2 projects. First, the Lisa, named after Jobs' daughter. It would be the first commercial computer with a graphical user interface. Second, the Macintosh, a lower-cost version that could bring this technology to regular people. But creating these revolutionary computers nearly destroyed Apple and nearly destroyed Steve Jobs in the process. Here's what you need to understand about Steve Jobs in the early 1980s. He was brilliant, he was visionary, but he was also incredibly difficult to work with. He'd walk through the office and tell engineers their work was shit. He'd cry, he'd scream, he'd praise you one moment and crush you the next. He had what people called a reality distortion field, the ability to convince himself and others that impossible things were possible. Sometimes that worked. He pushed his team to create things they didn't think they could create. But other times it was just destructive. The Lisa project was a disaster. The computer cost $10,000. It was too expensive, too slow. And because Jobs had been removed from the Lisa team, he poured all his difficult energy into the Macintosh. He wanted the Mac to be perfect, not just good, perfect. The engineers worked insane hours. Jobs pushed them relentlessly. Real artists ship, he'd tell them, meaning that real artists finish their work and put it out into the world. The Mac finally launched in January 1984 with one of the most famous commercials in history. The 1984 commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, aired during the Super Bowl. It showed a dystopian world controlled by Big Brother and a woman throwing a hammer through the screen. The message was clear. IBM was Big Brother. Apple was the rebel fighting for individual empowerment. The Mac was incredible, beautiful, revolutionary. But it had problems. It was slow. It didn't have enough memory. It couldn't run many programs. And it cost $2,500. Sales started strong, but quickly fell off. By the middle of 1985, Apple was in trouble. And then came the power struggle that would change Steve Jobs' life. John Sculley had been recruited from Pepsi to be Apple's CEO. Jobs had personally recruited him with one of the most famous lines in business history. "Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley came, and at first he and Jobs worked well together. But as the Mac struggled and Apple sales fell, tensions grew. The board of directors saw Jobs as the problem. He was too erratic, too demanding, too volatile. In May 1985, there was a boardroom showdown. Sculley wanted to remove Jobs from managing the Macintosh division. The board had to choose, Sculley or Jobs. They chose Sculley. Steve Jobs was removed from all management responsibilities at the company he'd founded. He was 30 years old, and he was devastated. He tried to convince board members to reverse the decision. He failed. He tried to organize a coup to oust Sculley. That failed too. Finally, in September 1985, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. "I've been rejected," he told friends, "but I'm still in love." Most people thought Steve Jobs' career was over. The boy genius who'd revolutionized personal computing, brought down by his own ego and difficult personality. They were wrong. Steve Jobs' most important work hadn't even begun. After leaving Apple, Jobs did two things that seemed crazy at the time, but turned out to be genius. First, he bought a computer company from George Lucas's film empire for $10 million. The company was called Pixar. It made high-end computers for graphics professionals. Jobs had no idea how to turn it into a successful business, but he believed in the technology. Second, he started a new computer company called Next. It would make high-end computers for universities and research institutions, beautiful machines, cutting-edge technology, but also expensive, really expensive. For the next 11 years, Jobs poured his energy into these two companies, and honestly, neither was succeeding. Next never made a profit. The computers were too expensive. Universities couldn't afford them. The company was bleeding money. Pixar was even worse. They couldn't sell their computers. Jobs kept the company alive through his own investment, burning through $50 million of his own money over the years. But then, in 1995, Pixar released a movie, a completely computer-animated movie, something that had never been done before. The movie was called Toy Story. It was a massive hit, a cultural phenomenon. And when Pixar went public a week after Toy Story's release, Steve Jobs' stake in the company was suddenly worth $1.2 billion. Overnight, Steve Jobs went from struggling entrepreneur to billionaire, not from computers, from animated movies about talking toys. But the bigger transformation was still coming. By 1996, Apple was dying. The company had lost its way. It had too many products. None of them were great. Microsoft had dominated the PC market. Apple's market share had fallen to about 3%. The company was losing money and running out of cash. Apple needed a new operating system. They'd been trying to develop one for years and failing. So they decided to buy one. They looked at several options, including Next. In December 1996, Apple bought Next for $429 million. And Steve Jobs came back to Apple as an advisor. Within months, the board fired the CEO, and in September 1997, Steve Jobs became Apple's interim CEO, ICEO they called it. Interim. He wouldn't accept the interim designation for years, but he immediately started fixing Apple with the same ruthless intensity that had caused problems before. Only now, he'd learned from his mistakes. He cut Apple's product line from dozens of products to just 4, laptops and desktops, consumer and professional. That's it. Everything else was canceled. He made a deal with Microsoft. Apple would make Internet Explorer the default browser on Mac. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to supporting Office on Mac for 5 years. When Jobs announced this partnership at Macworld, the audience booed. They saw Microsoft as the enemy. But Jobs understood something they didn't. Apple needed Microsoft more than Microsoft needed Apple. And this deal bought Apple time. Then Jobs did something that seemed small at the time but changed everything. He pushed his team to design a new computer for consumers who wanted simplicity. The result was the iMac. It launched in August 1998, and it was unlike any computer anyone had ever seen. It was translucent, colorful. It came in Bondi blue. It had no floppy drive, just a CD-ROM. It had built-in Internet capabilities. Traditional computer makers mocked it. Who wants a computer in those colors, they asked. Why would you remove the floppy drive? Consumers answered those questions. They bought iMacs by the millions. The iMac single-handedly saved Apple from bankruptcy. But Jobs wasn't done, because he'd realized something crucial. Apple shouldn't just make computers. Apple should make products that fit seamlessly into people's lives. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, a music player that could hold 1,000 songs. 1,000 songs in your pocket, Jobs said at the launch. Other companies had made MP3 players, but the iPod was different. It was beautiful, easy to use, and it worked seamlessly with iTunes. Within a few years, the iPod dominated the music player market, but more importantly, it taught Jobs a lesson. Apple could succeed in consumer electronics beyond computers. Then came the moment that would define Steve Jobs' ultimate legacy. In 2005, during a meeting, one of Jobs' engineers showed him a prototype. It was a multi-touch screen, a display you could control with your fingers. You could pinch, zoom, swipe. It was magical. Jobs immediately saw the potential, not for a tablet, which is what the engineer was thinking, but for a phone. He gathered a small team and gave them an impossible mission. Create a phone that's also a complete computer, a phone with no keyboard, just a touch screen. A phone that can browse the internet, play music, and do everything a computer can do, and make it so simple that anyone can use it. The team thought he was crazy. Mobile phones at the time had tiny screens and physical keyboards. The most popular phone was the BlackBerry. The idea of a computer phone with no keyboard seemed absurd. But Jobs pushed. He demanded. He applied that reality distortion field again. And in January 2007, he walked on stage at Macworld and said words that would echo through history. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. He pulled out the iPhone. The crowd went crazy. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, Jobs said. Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer laughed at it. $500, he scoffed, fully subsidized, with a plan? That is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard. Ballmer was spectacularly wrong. The iPhone changed everything. It destroyed the mobile phone industry. Nokia, Motorola, BlackBerry, companies that had dominated for decades, were gone within a few years. But the iPhone did more than that. It created a new category, the smartphone. Today there are billions of smartphones in the world, and they're all descendants of the iPhone. After the iPhone came the iPad. After the iPad came the Apple Watch. Each product expanded Apple's ecosystem. Each product made the others more valuable. If you had an iPhone, you'd want a Mac because they work together seamlessly. If you had a Mac, you'd want an iPad. The ecosystem was the strategy. But by 2011, Steve Jobs was sick. Pancreatic cancer. He'd been fighting it for years. In August 2011, he resigned as CEO. I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. Tim Cook took over as CEO, and on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died. He was 56 years old. The world mourned. People left flowers at Apple stores around the world. World leaders issued statements. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Apple itself. The next day, Apple's website was replaced with a single photo of Jobs and the dates of his life, 1955 to 2011. Below the photo, just 3 words: Steve Jobs, visionary, leader. So what can we learn from Steve Jobs' path to billions? Because that's really what this is all about, right? Understanding not just what he did, but how he did it, and whether any of it applies to us. Here's the first lesson. Passion beats credentials. Steve Jobs dropped out of college, but he never stopped learning. He dropped in on calligraphy class because it interested him. He studied Buddhism in India. He obsessed over design. He learned not for credentials or grades, but because he was genuinely curious. That calligraphy class, the one that seemed completely useless, became the foundation for Apple's obsession with typography and design. You never know which lessons will matter, so learn everything. Second lesson, find a partner who complements your weaknesses. Jobs and Wozniak were opposites. Jobs was the salesman and visionary. Woz was the engineer and craftsman. Alone, neither would have succeeded. Together, they were unstoppable. If you're the visionary, find an executor. If you're the engineer, find a marketer. The most successful companies are almost always founded by complementary partners. Third lesson, the intersection is where magic happens. Jobs loved to talk about standing at the intersection of technology and liberal arts. Apple's products weren't just technologically advanced, they were beautiful, they were intuitive, they reflected humanistic values. Too many tech companies build features for the sake of features. Jobs built products for humans. That's why people loved Apple products in a way they didn't love other tech products. Find your intersection, the place where your unique skills and interests overlap. Fourth lesson, say no to 1,000 things. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he cut almost everything. Dozens of products were canceled. Only 4 product lines remained. Focus is about saying no. Every entrepreneur wants to build more products, chase more opportunities, add more features. Jobs understood that real power comes from restraint, from doing fewer things better, from perfection through subtraction, not addition. Fifth lesson, control the entire experience. If Apple didn't just make computers, they made the operating system, the retail stores, the customer service experience. Later, they controlled the hardware, the software, the services, and the retail experience. This gave Apple incredible power. They could optimize every part of the customer journey. They could ensure quality. They could capture more value. Yes, it's harder. Yes, it requires more investment. But the returns are worth it. Sixth lesson, reality distortion field isn't always bad. Jobs was famous for his reality distortion field, his ability to convince people that impossible things were possible. Sometimes this was manipulative, but sometimes it pushed people to achieve things they never thought they could achieve. Henry Ford said, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." Jobs lived that philosophy. He believed limitations were mostly in people's minds, and by believing, he made his teams believe, and by believing, they did the impossible. But let's be honest, there are parts of Steve Jobs' story we shouldn't try to replicate. He was often cruel to employees, he parked in handicapped spots, he initially denied paternity of his first daughter. He could be petty and vindictive. He wasn't a saint, not even close. You can be demanding without being cruel. You can have high standards without destroying people. You can change the world without being an asshole. Jobs himself seemed to understand this later in life. Tim Cook, his successor, said that near the end, Jobs told him, "Don't ask yourself what I would do. Just do what's right." That's powerful. Jobs knew his way wasn't always the right way. He was giving Cook permission to be a different kind of leader, a kinder one. So take the lessons that matter, the passion, the focus, the design obsession, the willingness to think differently, the courage to bet everything on your vision. But leave behind the cruelty, the ego, the reality distortion when it becomes reality denial. Let's talk about what Steve Jobs left behind, because his legacy isn't just money or even products, it's the way he changed how we think about technology. Before Jobs, computers were tools, functional objects. After Jobs, Technology could be beautiful. It could be an expression of who you are. It could be, as he said in that famous commercial, for the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers. Today, Apple is worth over $3 trillion. It's the most valuable company in human history. The iPhone generates more revenue than all of Microsoft. The Apple Watch outsells the entire Swiss watch industry. But here's what's even more remarkable. Apple maintains profit margins that other tech companies can only dream about. They do this not by being the cheapest or even by having the most features. They do it by creating products people love, products people will wait in line for, products people will pay premium prices for. That's Jobs' real genius. He understood that business isn't just about features and specs. It's about emotion. It's about desire. It's about creating products that people don't just need, but want. Think about how rare that is. Most companies make products people need. Very few make products people want. Even fewer make products people love. Jobs built a company that consistently, generation after generation, makes products people love. So here's my final thought, and it's the most important one. Steve Jobs didn't succeed because he was perfect. He succeeded because he was willing to fail. The Lisa failed, Next failed, Pixar almost failed. Even the iPhone could have failed. But Jobs kept going. He learned from each failure. He adapted. He persevered. When he was fired from Apple in 1985, he could have given up. He could have retired early. He was already wealthy. Instead, he spent 11 years in the wilderness, learning, growing, making mistakes. And when he came back to Apple, he was a different person, still demanding, still visionary, but wiser, more focused, more effective. Here's what he said about getting fired from Apple. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. That's the lesson. The setback that seems like the end might actually be the beginning. The failure that feels like death might be rebirth. So if you're struggling right now, if your business isn't working, if you feel like you've failed, remember Steve Jobs in 1985, devastated, rejected, lost. And remember Steve Jobs in 2007, standing on stage, holding an iPhone, about to change the world. The journey between those two moments, that's what matters, not the destination, the journey. Steve Jobs was many things: visionary, tyrant, genius, jerk, innovator, control freak. But above all, he was persistent. He never gave up on his vision of creating insanely great products that would change the world. And he did exactly that, 5 times. The personal computer, computer-animated movies, digital music, smartphones, tablets, 5 different industries, 5 revolutions. Not bad for a college dropout who started in his parents' garage. If you take away one thing from Steve Jobs' story, let it be this: your background doesn't determine your future. Jobs was adopted. His parents didn't go to college. He dropped out. None of that mattered. What mattered was his vision, his passion, his willingness to take risks, his obsession with quality, his ability to convince talented people to join him on impossible journeys. You don't need a college degree to change the world. You don't need wealthy parents or connections. You need a vision. You need persistence. You need to be willing to fail. And you need to care, really care, about creating something excellent. The rest, the rest is just details. Steve Jobs proved that a person with a vision and the courage to pursue it can literally change the world. He started in a garage and built the most valuable company in history. He did it by thinking different, by staying hungry, by staying foolish. And so can you. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into how Steve Jobs made his billions. If this story inspired you, or if you learned something valuable, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about how billionaires made their fortunes, subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from. Remember, stay hungry, stay foolish, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't change the world, because if a barefoot college dropout in a garage can do it, maybe you can too. See you in the next one.